It felt like watching someone steal my soul and put it on display under glass. That's the only way I can describe it. I was sitting in the third row of the museum's auditorium, a place I usually loved, and watching Julian Vance, our senior curator, present what he was calling his next big exhibition. He was animated, his hands gesturing grandly, his voice resonating with a passion he'd manufactured just for the occasion. He spoke of a profound, almost spiritual connection he felt to the subject, a forgotten female artisan from Philadelphia's revolutionary past. He described the thrill of unearthing her story, of piecing together a life from faded letters and delicate hand-carved objects. My life. He was describing my work, my discovery, my connection. My hands were clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white, and a cold, sick feeling was spreading through my stomach. This wasn't just about a stolen idea. He was erasing me from my own story, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't let him. That quiet, gut-wrenching moment was the beginning of the end, and the start of a new, terrifying, and ultimately liberating chapter of my life. My name is Maya Linwood, and I'm a historical archivist, or at least I was. It sounds like a quiet, dusty profession, and in many ways it is. But for me, it was never about the dust. It was about the magic. I've always believed that history isn't just a collection of dates and facts. It's a living, breathing thing, made up of a million forgotten whispers. My job was to listen to those whispers. For 7 years, I had the privilege of working at the Philadelphia Heritage Museum, a beautiful old institution nestled in the heart of Old City. It wasn't the biggest or flashiest museum, but it had a soul. Its collection was a treasure trove of local history, and the archives, my domain, were its heart. The archives were in the sub-basement, a climate-controlled labyrinth of rolling shelves, gray acid-free boxes, and the gentle, constant hum of dehumidifiers. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and game itself. To most, it would probably seem sterile and boring, but to me, it was a sanctuary. Every box held a potential story, a direct link to someone who lived and breathed and loved and suffered on the very same streets I walked every day. I earned my master's in library and information science with a specialization in archival studies from Drexel, and landing a job at the Heritage Museum felt like coming home. I wasn't just cataloging objects, I was preserving legacies. My mentor and direct supervisor was Dr. Alastair Finch, the head archivist. Alastair was in his late 60s with a shock of white hair that refused to be tamed and a pair of spectacles perpetually perched on the end of his nose. He had been at the museum for over 40 years and knew the collection like the back of his hand. He was a man of quiet integrity, more comfortable with 18th century correspondence than with office politics. He saw my passion from day one and took me under his wing. "The curator gets the glory, Maya," he told me once, a wry smile on his face as we carefully handled a fragile diary from the 1800s. "But the archivist gets the truth, remember that." He taught me everything: how to read the subtle clues in a water-stained ledger, how to trace the provenance of an unsigned miniature portrait, how to handle documents so brittle they threatened to turn to dust at a touch. He trusted me, and under his guidance I thrived. Then there was Julian Vance. Julian was the museum's senior curator of American history. He was everything Alastair and I were not. He was slick, polished, and exuded an almost theatrical charisma. In his mid-40s, he wore impeccably tailored suits that seemed out of place in our world of cardigans and sensible shoes. He'd come from a prestigious gallery in New York, and he never let anyone forget it. He was a master at charming the board of trustees and schmoozing wealthy donors at galas. He talked a brilliant game, weaving grand narratives about the museum's mission and its vital role in the cultural landscape. But when it came to the actual granular work of history, he was profoundly lazy. He rarely ventured down into the archives. When he did, he treated it like a visit to a foreign country, looking slightly uncomfortable and out of his element. He'd refer to the meticulous work Alistair and I did as sourcing assets for his exhibitions. He had an idea for a show, usually something broad and crowd-pleasing, and would send down a request. Find me 3 to 5 compelling objects related to the maritime trade pre-1820. He wasn't interested in the stories or the research. He just wanted the finished product, the shiny object he could put in a display case with his name on the curatorial text. Alistair tolerated him with a quiet, simmering disdain. "He's a showman, not a historian," he'd mutter after Julian left. "He sells the tickets. We provide the show." The dynamic worked, more or less, until Alistair announced his retirement. His departure would leave a void, not just in the archives, but in the institutional memory of the museum. A few weeks before his retirement party, he called me into his small, cluttered office. "Maya," he said, looking at me over the top of his glasses, "the board is planning a major exhibition for next fall, a real blockbuster, something to anchor the next big fundraising campaign. Evelyn is letting Julian take the lead, of course." Dr. Evelyn Reed was our museum director. She was a formidable administrator, brilliant with budgets and strategic plans, but she was utterly captivated by Julian's charm. She saw him as the face of the museum's future, dynamic, sophisticated, and media savvy. To her, people like Alistair and me were the quiet, reliable engine of the museum, necessary but not particularly exciting. "Julian will want something with a wow factor," Alistair continued, "but he won't find it himself. He'll come to you. This is your chance, Maya, not just to contribute, but to lead. Find something undeniable, something so compelling that even Julian can't ignore your role in its discovery. Curating an exhibit like that, it could make your career." The idea lit a fire in me. This was what I had been working for. Not just to be the person in the basement who found things, but to be the person who told their stories. I had a deep, proprietary love for the history I worked with, and the thought of shaping a major exhibition was a dream I'd barely allowed myself to entertain. I started my search with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't want to just find another revolutionary musket or a piece of silver from a famous family. I wanted to find one of those forgotten whispers and make it roar. My search led me to the sub-basement, to a section of the archives known as Accession Purgatory. It was where items ended up when they were part of a large unsorted donation, often sitting for decades until someone had the time to go through them. I was working my way through a collection donated in the 1950s from a defunct local historical society. Most of it was junk: boring civic records, moth-eaten flags, unremarkable portraits of men in wigs. But in the back of a large crate, tucked underneath a pile of crumbling almanacs, was a small, unassuming wooden chest. It wasn't listed on the manifest. It had no accession number. The lock was rusted shut. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was the moment every archivist dreams of. I carefully brought the chest to my workspace and, with delicate tools, managed to open it without damaging the wood. The inside was lined with faded blue silk, and nestled within were not just objects, but a life. There was a collection of about 30 letters tied in a ribbon. There was a small leather-bound diary, its pages filled with elegant, spidery script, and there were several small, exquisitely carved wooden objects: a songbird, a delicate flower, a miniature ship with tiny, intricate rigging. They were signed with a small, almost hidden mark, an EM. I spent the next 2 weeks consumed. I carefully humidified and flattened the letters, transcribing them word for word. I read the diary from cover to cover, my breath catching in my throat as a voice from over 200 years ago spoke directly to me. The story that emerged was astounding. The items belonged to a woman named Eliza Maywood. She was the wife of a minor merchant, a man whose name appeared in a few city records but was otherwise unremarkable. But Eliza Eliza was a secret artist. At a time when women were expected to be wives and mothers, she was creating these incredible detailed carvings in secret, sometimes selling them anonymously through a sympathetic cousin to earn a little money of her own. Her letters and diary were a vivid, intelligent, and often heartbreaking account of a creative soul trapped by the constraints of her time. She wrote about the revolution, not in terms of battles and politics, but in how it affected the price of wood, the fear of soldiers in the streets, the struggle to maintain a small island of beauty and creation in a world of chaos. This wasn't just a minor domestic correspondence. This was a revolutionary act in itself, a woman's story, a creator's story, from a period almost exclusively chronicled by men. This was it. This was my undeniable discovery. I documented everything meticulously. I photographed the chest and its contents before and after preservation. I scanned every single page of the letters and the diary. I created a detailed research file, tracing Eliza's family, cross-referencing names in her diary with city archives, building a complete picture of her life. I spent late nights and weekends lost in the 18th century, feeling a kinship with this woman I would never meet. Her voice felt like a friend's. When I had a comprehensive proposal ready, I scheduled a meeting with Julian. Alistair had already retired, so it was just me. I laid it all out for him on the conference room table. The transcripts, the photographs of the carvings, my research notes. I spoke with all the passion and excitement that had been building in me for weeks. Julian listened with a look of polite boredom. He picked up one of the photos of a carving, a tiny, perfect bird. Charming, he said, the word dripping with condescension. A lovely piece of folk art. Very domestic. It's more than that, Julian, I insisted, my heart sinking. It's a completely unique perspective on the period. A female artist working in secret, documenting her life. We could build an entire exhibition around her. The secret art of Eliza Maywood. We could recreate her workshop, show the carvings alongside her diary entries. He held up a hand, stopping me. Maya, I appreciate the enthusiasm. I really do. But we're looking for a blockbuster. This is small. It's a niche interest. Maybe we can do a blog post about it on the museum website. A nice little human interest story. He gathered my papers, not even looking at them, and slid them back across the table. Thanks for the effort. Keep digging. I walked back down to the archives, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. All that work, all that passion, dismissed in 5 minutes. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't seen her. I put Eliza's file away, a dull ache in my chest. For the next couple of weeks, I tried to move on, to find something else, something bigger, something Julian would deem worthy. But my heart wasn't in it. Everything else felt pale and insignificant compared to Eliza's story. About a month later, Evelyn Reed sent out a department-wide email. Please join me in congratulating Julian Vance, who has developed a truly groundbreaking concept for our next major exhibition, a revolution of her own, the lost world of Eliza Maywood. Julian's visionary work has unearthed the story of a forgotten female artisan from the Revolutionary era, and his curatorial direction promises to deliver one of the most compelling exhibitions in this museum's history. I read the email 3 times, the words blurring in front of my eyes. His visionary work, his curatorial direction. I felt the blood drain from my face. He hadn't just stolen my idea. He'd stolen her name, her story, the very title I had murmured to myself in the quiet of the archives. The next day, he called me to his office. He was beaming, expansive, triumphant. Maya, great news, he said, as if we were co-conspirators. Remember that little folk artist you found? Well, I was thinking about her, and I had a flash of inspiration. I realized she wasn't just a curiosity. She's the whole show. I pitched it to Evelyn and the board, and they went wild for it. I just stared at him, speechless. So, here's the thing. he continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. I'm going to be swamped with the fundraising and the big picture stuff. I need a detail person, someone who can handle the nitty-gritty. And I immediately thought of you. You already have a bit of a head start on the research. I want you to be the lead research associate for the exhibition. It'll be a great credit for you. Lead research associate, a glorified assistant on my own project. I should have walked out right then. I should have thrown my meticulous files on his desk and told him exactly what I thought of his flash of inspiration. But I was stunned, and I was scared. I was a mid-level archivist. He was the Golden Boy senior curator, backed by the director. Who would they believe? And a part of me, a foolish, desperate part, still wanted to be involved. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else handling Eliza's story, of them getting it wrong. If I stayed, at least I could protect her legacy. Okay, I heard myself say, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I'll do it. Excellent, he boomed, clapping his hands together. I knew I could count on you. Now I'll need a full research brief, all the biographical data, and a draft of the potential exhibit narrative by the end of next week. I have a preliminary meeting with the design team. And so it began. For the next 6 months, I lived a surreal double life. By day, I was Julian's subordinate, and by night, I was the secret, uncredited curator of the Eliza Maywood exhibition. The arrangement was a special kind of torment. I was doing all the work that I loved, but every piece of it was filtered through him and rebranded as his own. He would email me late on a Friday afternoon. Maya, the donor packet needs a more evocative description of Eliza's world. Can you punch it up? Need it by Monday a.m. Punching it up meant I would spend my entire weekend writing a 2-page, historically rich narrative, sourcing quotes from her diary, and crafting what I knew would be a compelling story for potential funders. On Monday morning, I would email it to him. On Tuesday, I'd see my exact words, verbatim, in a memo he sent to the development department under the heading, Some of My Thoughts on the Narrative Framework. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. I wrote the detailed object labels. I selected the accompanying artifacts from the museum's collection that would provide context. I built the definitive timeline of Eliza's life. I even found a living descendant of Eliza's cousin in rural Pennsylvania, a sweet elderly woman who had a small painted portrait of Eliza that had been passed down through her family. It was the only known image of her. I conducted the interview, negotiated the loan of the portrait, and handled all the complex paperwork. The next week, at a staff meeting, Julian announced his incredible stroke of luck. Through some deep genealogical detective work, he said, smiling at Evelyn, I managed to track down a living relative and secure the only known portrait of Eliza. It was a long shot, but I had a hunch. My colleagues weren't blind. Sarah, the head of conservation, would often find excuses to come down to the archives. She'd watch me painstakingly working on Eliza's artifacts. This is incredible work, Maya, she said one afternoon, her voice soft. The level of detail is amazing. She looked me right in the eye. You're the real curator of this show, you know. We all see it. Her words were a small comfort, but they also highlighted the injustice. Everyone saw it, but no one could say anything. Julian's power, granted by Evelyn, was absolute. The resentment began to fester inside me, a low-grade fever that never broke. It started affecting my life outside the museum. My partner, Alex, bore the brunt of it. Alex is an architect, a man who deals in concrete plans and solid structures. He couldn't comprehend the subtle, gaslighting world of museum politics I was living in. I'd come home late, exhausted and angry, and vent to him for an hour. Why don't you just go to Evelyn? He'd ask, his frustration growing on my behalf. Show her your original files, your emails. The proof is all there. It's not that simple, Alex, I'd say, for the 10th time. It's my word against his. He's the star. I'm just staff. If I make a fuss, I'll be labeled as difficult, as not a team player. I could lose my job. So he just gets to get away with it? It seems so. I'd whisper, the admission feeling like a failure. Our relationship, usually my safe harbor, became strained. I was distant, obsessive, constantly checking my work email, waiting for the next demeaning request from Julian. I stopped sleeping well, waking up at 3 a.m. with my mind racing, replaying conversations, thinking of all the things I should have said. The joy I once felt in my work had curdled into a bitter obligation. I was only staying, I told myself, for Eliza, to make sure her story was told right, but I was starting to realize that my own story was being completely erased in the process. The turning point, the moment the fever finally broke and turned into a cold, hard resolve, came about 2 months before the exhibition was set to open. The museum's PR department had arranged for Julian to be interviewed by a local arts and culture program on the public television station. It was a huge coup, a major promotional event. The entire staff gathered in the break room to watch it air during lunch. There he was, on the screen, looking polished and authoritative, sitting in a recreation of an 18th century parlor. He was holding a facsimile of one of Eliza's carvings. The interviewer was hanging on his every word. "Mr. Vance," she said, "what was it like, that moment of discovery, the moment you first realized what you had found?" Julian looked down at the carving in his hand, a thoughtful, almost pained expression on his face. He was a good actor. I had to give him that. "It's hard to put into words," he began, his voice hushed. "When I first opened that little chest and read Eliza's words, it was like a ghost reaching out across the centuries. I felt this immediate, profound connection to her, a sense of responsibility. I knew in that moment that I had to be the one to tell her story." He then proceeded to quote verbatim a paragraph from the very first research proposal I had written for him, the one he had dismissed as a nice little human interest story. He used my phrases, my analysis, my heartfelt words about Eliza's quiet rebellion and the art of survival. He was performing my passion, my intellectual and emotional labor, for a television audience. Something inside me snapped. It was a clean, quiet break. The hurt and frustration I'd been swallowing for months crystallized into a diamond-hard point of anger. It wasn't just about credit anymore. It was about truth. He had stolen the truth, both Eliza's and mine. Alistair's words echoed in my head. The curator gets the glory, but the archivist gets the truth. In that moment, watching Julian lie so beautifully on television, I decided it was time to bring the truth out of the archives and into the light. When I got home that night, Alex knew instantly that something had changed. The frantic, helpless anger was gone, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. I didn't vent. I didn't complain. I walked into my home office, pulled out a legal pad, and started to make a list. "What are you doing?" he asked, standing in the doorway. "I'm building a case," I said, not looking up. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. The plan began to form, not as a messy act of revenge, but as a cool, calculated archival project. The subject of this collection? The systemic fraud of Julian Vance. The primary source material? My own damn work. The first person I called was Alistair. I told him everything, from the initial discovery to the television interview. He listened patiently, the silence on his end of the line growing heavier with each detail I shared. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The man is a peacock," he finally said, his voice laced with cold fury. "All feathers and no substance. I'm so sorry, Maya. I encouraged you to find something undeniable, and in doing so, I led you right into the lion's den." "It's not your fault, Alistair," I said, "but I need your advice. What do I do?" "You document," he said without hesitation. "You're an archivist, my dear. It's what we do. Create an unassailable record. Dates, times, emails, drafts. Build a fortress of facts. A showman like Julian can't survive in a fortress of facts." The second person I called was my older sister, Chloe. Chloe is a labor attorney in New York. She is in every way my opposite, pragmatic, unsentimental, and fiercely confrontational. When I laid out the situation, her response was immediate and tactical. Okay, first, you are not to speak to HR. They exist to protect the company, not you, she instructed, her lawyer voice already in full effect. Second, you need to create a secure offsite backup of every piece of evidence. Use a personal cloud account, not your work computer. Third, we need to map the power structure. Who is on the board of trustees? Specifically, who is the head of the ethics or collections committee? That's our target. Following her and Alistair's advice, I began my project. Over the next few weeks, I spent my nights and weekends assembling what I internally called the Vance dossier. It was the most meticulous archival work of my life. I created a timeline, starting with the date I first discovered Eliza's chest. I printed every email exchange with Julian, his initial dismissal, his sudden flash of inspiration, his endless requests for work. I used a software program to recover the metadata from my original research files, showing they were created on my computer weeks before Julian ever mentioned Eliza's name to Evelyn. I created side-by-side comparisons, my draft of the exhibit text next to the final version with his name on it, showing they were 95% identical. I included a copy of the loan agreement for the portrait, which I had negotiated, and a transcript of my interview with the descendant. I even got a quiet, off-the-record statement from Sarah in conservation, who was willing to attest that she had seen me working on the Eliza research long before the exhibition was announced, and had never once seen Julian in the conservation lab. As I compiled the evidence, a strange thing happened. My fear and anger began to transform into a sense of profound clarity. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an investigator, a historian uncovering a contemporary injustice. The work was empowering. While I was building my arsenal, I was also building my escape route. Alex was my biggest champion. "This place is toxic, Maya," he said one night, watching me organize my files. "Even if you win, you lose. You can't stay there." "But this is my whole career, Alex. The museum world is small." "So make a bigger world," he replied. "You love this stuff, right? Finding these forgotten stories? Why does the Heritage Museum get to be the only gatekeeper? What if you could tell Eliza's story and other stories like hers without them?" The idea was a spark. For days, I couldn't get it out of my head. The internet had democratized so much of the world. Why not public history? I started researching. I looked into digital humanities grants, open source museum software, and online storytelling platforms. A new plan began to take shape, one that ran parallel to my dossier. I started sketching out a concept for a website, a digital archive dedicated to unearthing and sharing lost histories. I called it Forgotten Voices. The idea terrified me, but it also thrilled me. It was a way to reclaim not just Eliza's story, but my own narrative. To build something that was wholly mine, founded on the very principles of truth and integrity that the museum had abandoned. The final piece of my plan fell into place about 3 weeks before the exhibition's grand opening gala. The museum was buzzing with frantic energy. Julian was in his element, holding court with journalists, designers, and donors. He had delegated nearly all of the final, painstaking installation work to me and a few others. "I have to focus on the strategic rollout," he'd say. Before disappearing for a 3-hour lunch, he called me into his office one afternoon. "Maya, I need you to do a final proofread of the exhibition catalog before it goes to the printer. Every page. Check for typos, factual errors, everything. It's my name on the cover, so it has to be perfect." I spent the next 2 days combing through the 200-page glossy catalog. It was beautifully designed. And on the title page, in large, elegant font, it read, "A Revolution of Her Own, The Lost World of Eliza Maywood, curated by Julian Vance. Research by the staff of the Philadelphia Heritage Museum." My name was nowhere. I wasn't even mentioned in the acknowledgments. He had erased me completely. That was the final confirmation. There was no salvaging my career at this institution. My only path was out. I finished the proofread. Then, I finalized my dossier. It was now a 50-page, meticulously organized document, complete with a table of contents and an executive summary. I printed 2 copies on high-quality paper. I wrote a simple 2-sentence letter of resignation, and I drafted an email. The day I chose was a Tuesday, 10 days before the opening gala. The timing was strategic. It was close enough to the opening to cause maximum chaos, but far enough out that they couldn't just brush it under the rug. I came to work dressed in a sharp, professional black dress that Chloe had insisted I buy. I felt like a soldier heading into battle. At 10:00 a.m., I walked up to the executive offices on the top floor. I went to Evelyn Reed's office first. Her assistant tried to stop me, saying she was on a conference call. "She'll want to take this," I said, with a calm I didn't feel, and walked in. Evelyn looked up, annoyed. "Maya, I'm in the middle of something." "This will only take a moment," I said, placing the resignation letter on her gleaming desk. "This is my 2 weeks' notice." Her annoyance shifted to weary frustration. "Oh, for heaven's sake! Maya, is this about the catalog? Julian told me you were upset about the credits. It was just an oversight. We can fix it in the second printing." "It's about much more than the catalog, Evelyn," I said, placing the thick dossier next to my resignation letter. "I think you'll want to read this. It's a summary of the curatorial and research process for the Maywood exhibition. I believe you'll find it very illuminating." A copy has also been sent to Mr. Abramson, the chair of the Board of Trustees, and to the head of the museum's ethics committee. I watched the color drain from her face as she picked up the dossier and read the executive summary. Her eyes widened. She flipped through the pages, seeing the side-by-side comparisons, the email printouts. Her professional composure crumbled, replaced by naked panic. "What is this? This is an ambush." "No," I said, my voice steady. "It's an archive. It's the truth. Something this museum has stopped valuing." "We can fix this," she said, her voice suddenly pleading. "Maya, let's talk about this. What do you want? The co-curator credit? Your own exhibition next year? A raise? Name it." I looked at her. At this powerful woman who had been so willfully blind because Julian's charm made her job easier, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. "I want to work somewhere with integrity," I said, "so I'm going to go build it myself." I turned and walked out of her office, leaving her sputtering with the dossier in her hands. My last stop was Julian's office. He was on the phone, laughing, probably with a donor. He waved me in impatiently. I placed the second copy of the dossier on his desk. He glanced at the cover, his smile faltering. "What's this?" "Light reading," I said. "I've just come from Evelyn's office. You should probably expect a call from her. And from the Board of Trustees. They seem to have some questions about your deep genealogical detective work." I watched his face cycle through confusion, then dawning comprehension, then pure, undiluted rage. "You," he started, his voice a venomous hiss. "Me," I said, giving him a small, tight smile. "The detail person, the one who keeps the records." As I walked back to my desk in the archives for the last time, my phone was already buzzing. It was Sarah. "What did you do?" her text read. "Evelyn just ran out of her office looking like she'd seen a ghost, and the head of the board is on his way over." I packed my few personal belongings into a box. A mug, a few books, a small photo of Alex. The air in the archives, which had felt heavy and suffocating for months, now felt light and full of possibility. I took one last look around my sanctuary of whispers, said a silent goodbye to Eliza, and walked out of the Philadelphia Heritage Museum for the last time, not looking back. The truth was out of its box. The 10 days between my resignation and the scheduled opening of the Eliza Maywood exhibition were a blur of controlled chaos. I fully expected to be blacklisted, to have my name dragged through the mud. But the fortress of facts I had built was too strong. My sister, Chloe, was my strategic commander, fielding calls and advising me on every step. The first official communication came from the museum's lawyer, a dry, formal letter acknowledging receipt of my materials and informing me that the Board of Trustees had launched a full internal investigation. Julian and Evelyn were placed on administrative leave. The gala was postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. The story began to leak, first in whispers among the city's tight-knit arts community, then in a carefully worded article in a local magazine. The piece didn't name names, but it spoke of a curatorial integrity crisis at the Heritage Museum. My phone lit up with messages of support from former colleagues and even acquaintances at other institutions who had long harbored suspicions about Julian's meteoric rise. It turned out his reputation for taking credit wasn't a secret. People were just afraid to challenge him. My dossier hadn't just exposed one fraud, it had validated the quiet knowledge of an entire community. About a week after I left, I received a call from Mr. Abramson, the chairman of the board. He was a retired judge, a man with a reputation for being thorough and fair. He was deeply apologetic. "Ms. Linwood," he said, his voice grave, "on behalf of the board, I want to offer you our most sincere apologies. What happened was an indefensible failure of management and ethics. The evidence you provided was conclusive. We have accepted Dr. Reed's resignation, and Mr. Vance's employment has been terminated." The news brought a complex wave of emotions: vindication, relief, but also a profound sadness for the institution I had once loved. "We would like to make things right," he continued. "The board has voted unanimously. We want to offer you the position of lead curator for the Eliza Maywood exhibition. We will scrap the existing catalog and print a new one with you as the sole credited curator. And we would like to discuss a permanent senior curatorial role for you at the museum, with a significant salary increase." A few months ago, this offer would have been the fulfillment of my wildest dreams. It was everything I had wanted: the recognition, the title, the chance to shape the museum's future. I could picture myself accepting, walking back into the museum in triumph. But the person who had dreamed that dream was gone. I had spent the last few weeks not looking back, but looking forward, building the scaffolding for my new life. "Mr. Abramson," I said, taking a deep breath, "I am truly grateful for the offer, and I appreciate the board's actions more than you know, but I have to decline. My path is headed in a different direction now." There was a surprised silence on the other end. "May I ask what that is?" "I'm starting a project called Forgotten Voices," I explained. "It's a digital archive dedicated to telling the stories of people like Eliza Maywood. I've realized that history shouldn't be confined to museum walls. It should be accessible to everyone. That's where my passion lies now." He was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said with what sounded like genuine respect, "I have a feeling our institution's loss will be the public's gain. Please, if there is ever anything the Heritage Museum can do to support your new endeavor, do not hesitate to ask." After that call, I felt a profound sense of closure. I hadn't just won a battle. I had chosen a different war, one fought on my own terms. I poured all my energy and my savings into Forgotten Voices. Alex helped me design a beautiful, user-friendly website. Alistair, my retired mentor, became my first board member and volunteer researcher. I started with Eliza's story, uploading high-resolution scans of her letters and diary, creating an interactive timeline of her life, and writing the narrative I had always wanted to write, free from any agenda but the truth. The launch was quiet. I shared it on a few academic listservs and with my small network. For the first few months, the only visitors were friends, family, and a handful of history buffs. I had moments of terrifying doubt. I had given up a prestigious, secure job for a passion project that was draining my bank account. But every time I uncovered a new story, a free black blacksmith in colonial Germantown, a female botanist who corresponded with Jefferson but was written out of the history books, I felt a thrill that no museum salary could ever buy. The breakthrough came about 6 months in. A popular history blogger stumbled upon the site and wrote a glowing review calling it one of the most exciting public history projects on the web. Traffic exploded overnight. I started getting emails from all over the country. A high school teacher in Oregon wrote to tell me she was using Eliza's diary as a primary source for her American history class. A woman from California emailed to say she thought one of the figures I was researching was her great-great-great-aunt. The project took on a life of its own. A year after I left the museum, I secured my first major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was enough to hire a part-time research assistant and upgrade the website. I moved my office out of my spare bedroom and into a small, sunny space in a co-working building. Forgotten Voices was no longer just a project. It was a real, growing organization. The Philadelphia Heritage Museum did eventually open the Eliza Maywood exhibition. They hired a guest curator who, by all accounts, did a fine job. The new catalog credited me as the original researcher and discoverer of the collection, and Mr. Abramson sent me a personal invitation to the opening. I politely declined. I had already told Eliza's story in my own way. About 2 years after my departure, I was speaking on a panel about digital history at a conference in Washington, D.C. As I was packing up my laptop afterward, a man approached me hesitantly. It took me a moment to place him. It was Julian. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was still there, but it seemed to hang off him. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. "Maya," he said, his voice quiet, "I just wanted to say, your panel was excellent. What you're doing with your site is really important." I looked at him. The man who had been my tormentor, the catalyst for the most difficult and transformative period of my life, and I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a vast, calm distance. His opinion no longer registered. "Thank you, Julian," I said simply. "I wish you well." I turned and walked away, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. My world was so much bigger now than the small, bitter stage on which we had played our parts. Today, Forgotten Voices has a staff of 3 and a global audience. We've launched a podcast, developed curriculum materials for schools, and helped families across the country connect with their own hidden histories. My relationship with Alex is stronger than ever. He was my partner not just in life, but in the terrifying, exhilarating risk of building a dream from scratch. We got married last spring in a small ceremony in a historic garden, surrounded by the quiet presence of the past. Sometimes, when I'm interviewing a young historian for an internship, I see that familiar spark in their eyes, that hunger for discovery, that fierce desire to prove their worth. I make a point of telling them a version of my story. I tell them that their work has value, their voice has power, and their integrity is the most precious asset they will ever possess. The greatest lesson I learned from that painful ordeal wasn't about revenge or winning. It was about ownership. True success isn't about having your name on a plaque or a title on a business card. It's about owning your work, your story, and your worth. The whispers of the past taught me how to listen, but the injustice of my present taught me how to speak. And I found that my voice, like Eliza's, was always there. All I had to do was decide to use it.